Friday, November 17th, 1972, started out about like any other autumn day in Richmond, Kentucky. There was a sense of excitement as 10 sports fans chartered a plane to Hopkinsville to watch the Madison High School Royal Purples in the state playoffs against Trigg County. But within 24 hours, everything stopped. It was the day Richmond stood still.
I think not only was the spirit so high, but the whole community rallied around our team. They traveled, went to all the games. I remember the mayors and all the other officials would be there at the games that we played in the playoffs. And we had some really good games. But honestly, the best team, and I say this in all sincerity, was not the team that won that game that night.
For me, what tied them together was supporting the community in that they wanted to go watch this football game. You know, and I was thinking yesterday, I was thinking about Madison Central's golf teams, the guys and the ladies, both of them winning. And, you know, I thought about my brother and his friends who got on that plane to want to go down to Western Kentucky, as I'm sure there were other people that have been to other places, watch sports teams. But they wanted, it was so important to them to go down there and watch, their alma mater and these kids play football in this, it wasn't a championship game, it was, one of the, leading up to that, one of the, playoff games.
We were honored to have been in it, and we had a very good team. In fact, that year we had been rated #1 in the state, and we were a little old Class A school. We probably had 26 kids on the team. And the other teams we were going up with sometimes had as many as 100. Lafayette, Henry Clay's, and teams like that. And so we played a very difficult schedule, but we were very successful, and we were so happy about that.
They supported those kids, to make that kind of effort. That's a long way down there. It's about a 3-4 hour drive, and they took their time and their effort, and it could have been many, many, many more, that happened to if they got a bigger plane, I guess. And that was the type of loyalty we had back in those days. I remember Madison High there's a banner up on Main Street, #1 in the state in football. And so the community picked up on that, and I don't know that the football team had anything to do with that. The community did,
One of his best friends was Martha Arbuckle, who she was about, I think maybe 2 years older than Ben. Martha Exline, she still lives here, but she was one of his best friends. But those kind of people. Freddie Blue was a good friend. Talbot Todd was a good friend. William Ray Salyer, Earl Combs, just all, a lot of the people that he played football with, that he golfed with, family cousins that I wasn't as close to, but he was. He was really close to my Aunt Delphia and my Aunt Jessie and spent a lot of time with them, more than I did.
Them going to Boonesboro when my great Aunt Delphia and her husband was the lockmaster. And, Boonesboro used to be a beach, believe it or not, folks. And back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was booming with people. And, my Aunt Del telling me stories about, Freddie and Talbot and Conrad Long and all those guys coming down there and spending the day at the beach and drinking some sort of purple passion that they had mixed together and sleeping on the beach that night. The stories that I would hear would be about when they were younger, and they all played football at Madison High. Roy Kidd was their coach, and all of them were made great friends. I mean, from the Talbot Todds to the Freddie Bellews, who was the dentist who until he passed away, was my dentist. We called Freddie the Tooth Fairy. because, Freddie was not that big of a guy. And, I remember talking to Freddie one time, and I said, Freddie, how did you, given your stature, he's not that tall, he's not that big. I said, how did you break and have all of these records at Madison High that were never broken? And he said, I had great linemen. He said, I had guys like your father. I had Conrad Long. I had, Taterhead Bosley. I had Dr. Jim Coy, running fullback. He said, but the other thing was, Ben, I ran the ball in fear because I did not want them to hit me. The stories that, that I would hear, about my father were ones that, he liked to have a good time. He was very, gregarious and liked to be around people. So, it's that kind of stuff, that I've heard from people. Your father did this, or me and your father one time went to a Reds baseball game, and we stopped off at the, at the Montgomery Inn, and there was a wedding going on, and it was the wedding was of Polish folks, and so it was Freddie Beluski and Ben Robinitsky and all this kind of stuff is how they introduced them. So they were wedding crashing, man, back in the in the early 70s. So
mainly just personality, larger than life, fellow well met, always doing something, right? Whether it be a prank or playing golf or doing some type of activity, but very active. And just, joy to be around. I had a minor surgery, hernia repair when I was a child, and I remember him at the hospital in a wheelchair taking me around, popping wheelies and going up and down the hall. But, that's about it. That's about it.
As a 14-year-old and a freshman on the football team, and it's if not the best, one of the best teams Madison's ever fielded in its history. We were 12-0, and on cloud 9 going to Hopkinsville to play the team that had won the championship the year before, Trigg County, and we were just real excited. And being a freshman, I knew I wasn't going to play or anything, so I was just enjoying it, and. We played the game. Very disappointing. We did not play anything like we were capable of playing. It just, I don't know. Things just didn't go well. And then after the game, we went back to the motel, and I didn't go out because, like I say, I was young. We probably had some of our players are probably, we'd had a great year, and we weren't, it was disappointing, but we weren't still proud of what we had done.
Jimmy's father was the superintendent at Madison County Schools. My mother worked for him for 11 years. Jimmy was actually a couple of years older than I was, but for some reason, we just connected, played baseball for Don Richardson together and that sort of thing, and I spent many a night in his home. And he had his license, and he'd come from Marbury where they lived and all the way to Bybee to pick me up, and take me places. And I actually introduced him to his wife-to-be. She was in my class, and probably 3 weeks before the crash. And I was just thinking about this. There in the bypass where Old Frisch's used to be on Lancaster Road, Lancaster Avenue, he pulled up beside me and she was with him. And he grabbed her hand and he held it up and she had a big diamond on. He said, "You started this. I guess I'm going to have to finish it." It's the last time I talked to him. He was a survivor, and things that went on in the world and things that went on with teenage guys and stuff like that. We made it through all those things, and he'd work things, a very intelligent guy, and wanted, of course, he was down there for the register office, or, that's what Jimmy wanted to do. That, I often think of what he would have been, because number one, he was smart. Number two, he had plenty of support behind him, his mom and his dad, and he could have been whatever he wanted to be.
Well, it was just a time. Jim Frankenberger, I knew him. It was back in the bar days, and he ran a bar, and He used to date a girl named Lily from New York. I know we used to have the best time together, and he was, just good bunch of young men. Hugh Robbins, up and coming, attorney. The Shackford, there's all just. I often say, what if we had those guys today? What would they accomplish in this community? Ben Robinson, businessman, good family, community person. Well, if you reflect back in '72, the population was probably only 18,000, maybe something to that nature. And and everybody was close knit, and actually everything was kind of combined downtown. There wasn't a lot of malls, and so everybody knew everybody. All the places we run around together were downtown, and so it was just a time that I'll never forget.
We lived on Holly Street, and he was friends with all the people at East Main Liquor. I think it was the name of it then, East Main Liquor. He was friends with all of them. He was always down there. They gathered down there a lot. Car wash. He owned a car wash, Monday's Car Wash, which is on Francis Street, and he detailed a lot of cars, and he knew everybody.
There was a chorus, a Masonic male chorus, and I accompanied them after their previous musician passed away. But I used to play then for Maurice Pee Wee Monday's solos, and that was a great joy. I was at that time around 20 years old, and to be around the men of the lodge was just a tremendous honor for me.
The reason there's so much interest in that football game, in 1956, Roy Kidd came to Richmond, Kentucky, and we went undefeated in football and had not won the conference CKC since 1925. So there's a lot of interest created. 1964, Bobby Harville comes up there, and I'm one of the assistant coaches on that team, and we go all the way to the final state, beat the #1 team in the state, Owensboro. So there was a lot of interest in Madison High football because of the success that several coaches had had before that. So there could have been any one of 50, 100 guys that could have been on that plane. But these 10 got tickets, got seats. Huey Robbins in particular was a really, really good friend. And Huey was one of these guys that could have been the governor of this state. He was so friendly and so smart, and everybody knew him and everybody liked him. I'll give you a Huey story. I'm sitting over on 3rd Street. I'm living in an apartment on 3rd Street and don't have a penny to my name. And Huey Robbins came over and gave me a $100 bill. I like to die. He just so kind. And I never asked him for it. He just shows up. That's the type of person he was.
You see some of these people on television, politicians or whatever, but you see how people gravitate to them. Hugh had that about him. And when you talk to people about him now that knew him back then, they were his friends. I tell you the same thing. The dynamic was very close. 3 brothers. Steve was the oldest. My dad was second oldest. And then there was Hugh. There's a daughter, too, Ida Sue, who lives in Ohio. And Ida Sue is the only one that's still living. I'm actually named after my Uncle Hugh. I'm George Hugh Robbins. So we're kind of carrying on the tradition, I guess. I'm going to ruin whatever good reputation he had. I can remember Huey having a phone under his jacket, and he would mess with people. Way before cell phones, I don't know where he got the thing, but he would ring it and everybody would look around, and then he'd say, "Oh, it must be this one." I mean, that, 1972 humor still works. There were 10 of them, not counting the pilot. But, they were from all walks of life. A couple of attorneys, beer distributor, Benny Robinson. He had the media there with, a couple of guys from the Register, a liquor store owner. I mean, it was all walks of life. So the tentacles from the event really spread across the whole community. Like the school system. Everybody somehow, some way is attached to the school system in a community. Whether you go there, you work there, you have kids there, you went there, everybody was attached to that flight in some way.
Of the 10, 4 played softball, and I was heavy into softball. I played high school sports for Model High School, and Roy Watson Jr. Played. He was 2 years ahead of me, but he played baseball and basketball at Model. And then when we graduated, we went to Eastern, and he was already the business manager of the Eastern Progress, and he knew I was interested in sports, so I became the sports editor of the Progress while he was business manager. So we still had the connection. And then about that time, we started playing softball, Industrial League softball here in Richmond. 2 of the other fellows on the plane, Jimmy House and David Guzlin, were on our softball team. And that summer, before the crash happened, after the games and even during the week, we would play rook. And all 3 of those guys and myself that was the game, and they were gone. It was hard to live through.
My sister was a cheerleader, so she actually was down there, and my brother, he went with a bunch of guys, so he was down there too. So I actually didn't see them until they got back home the next day, and it was just something we just never thought would happen.
Well, I was acquainted with everyone in some fashion, but I was particularly close to 3 of the victims that I played softball with and went to school with, worked with, and those included Jimmy House, who was one of my best friends, Roy Watson, and David Guzlin. And we spent a lot of time together during the summers playing softball. I think, in fact, that previous summer of 72, we had played 73 softball games around the central Kentucky in tournaments and so forth. So we were always together, and I went to school with Jimmy since 6th grade, and knew his family very well, spent a lot of time with them. So I was probably closer to Jimmy than anybody else that was on that plane. You know, this group of men, like I said, I knew all of them at some point. 8 of them were involved in the Richmond Softball League that Roy Watson worked so hard to put together. He was a very big advocate for men's softball, and he worked with the city for a while to try to influence the formation of the league, and he finally got that done. And I think that was an impact on 8 of the 10 that were killed. He had an impact on them because they all were involved in softball in some way.
Walking down up the street one day, my uncle's walking down the street, and he knew I was going to go to college. And he said, "I thought you was going to go to college." I said, "Well, I have to wait until September of 64. And he just started laughing. He said, "Jack, it's not high school. It's college. They got semesters. Get your butt down there. They got one starting probably in January." Well, anyway, one of the first guys I met was Ben Robinson. And he knew I had just come out of the Air Force, and he was a freshman in college. He just started in what would have been September of 63, I guess. And then I met him in February or March of 1964, and we became friends because he thought he wanted to go into the service. When I first got there and had met Ben, he said, after he got out of the Navy, and he told me, I said he was going to open a bar. And he said, I want to take you some of the bars in town. He took me to every redneck bar in town. He knew them all. Man, he said, now you just be quiet. I'll do the talking. And I'd go in there and I'd drink my beer and I'd be like this, you know. I'd look around and there wasn't anybody that looked like me. And man, he knew them all. He'd go in and of course, he delivered beer to all of them, you know. And such an amicable guy. I had a job in Cincinnati, but I didn't have a car, and I was hitchhiking home. So I was out on the portion of 75 that was finished, had my thumb out. I couldn't get a ride, and I said, oh, heck with it. I'm going to Daytona for spring break. So I crossed the road. I started hitchhiking down to Florida. Along comes this van full of Eastern guys, and Ben Robinson's one of them. So they picked me up, and I said, man, I got $26 in my pocket. I said, I'm going to have to stretch that out for a week. He said, come and stay with us in the room. He said, you can just stay free. You only got $26. He said, you stay free. And he said, I'll show you a place where you can go have all-you-can-eat breakfast for $2. Well, that'll work. So I filled myself up every morning with breakfast. But that kind of bonded our friendship. I really miss him to this day. Everybody liked Joey Hunter, that's for sure. He was, you couldn't help it like Joey. You know, he was such a character. And I told him one time, I said, Joey, I said, you're a character, but I bet you I'm a bigger character than you are. Yeah, he kind of laughed.
J.D. Frankenberger, who was on the plane, another good friend of mine, Sandy Hubbard, who's good friends with Jimmy's. J.D. owned the liquor store there on East Main Street. So the worst thing in the world he could ever do was ask me and Sandy Hubbard, hey, listen, guys, you know, can you all come by here about 10 o'clock, stock everything up for me, and, you know, and we're going to park our cars here. We'll meet you back here. We'll be back here by 12 or whatever it was supposed to be. We waited till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning.
My mother, when she would talk about it, she just said, you know, they asked for clearance to get to 10,000 feet. The tower said, you've got it. And then they went to 10,000 feet, and then, you know, that was it.
I said, man, they're not coming. The weather, they must be bogged down or something. So I went home, and it was probably 2:30 in the morning, drove all the way to Bobby. And like I say, I hadn't been home from service very long, so very light sleeper, and I heard my mother coming up the steps too early, and she just walked in the room and said, plane crash.
My spouse and I were living in Birmingham, and it was a Saturday morning. My dad called, asked to speak to my husband, which was kind of surprising. Number one, he called early in the morning. I don't remember exactly what time it was, but he called and asked to speak to Jimmy Dale, and then that's how I found out too. I went over to my principal's house and gave my plans and told him what had happened, and he had seen it on television, down in Birmingham. It had been reported in Birmingham also about the plane crash.
I look at it, through the lens of a 6-year-old, because I was 6. I turned 6 on October the 7th, prior to the plane crash. So that's, that's kind of my lens from it. I knew about it the next morning. My mom was up all night, Susan, and she was up all night and, on the phone all night and crying and talking to folks. And state trooper came by our house at around... it was right at about daybreak.
I remember the day. I remember everybody coming over to the house, and then everybody was sad. I didn't quite get it. It's 3 and change. Why is everybody here? Why is everybody so sad?
No one knew anything. The next morning we come down, and the whole atmosphere, we'd been sad the night before losing, but that was totally forgotten. That game never was brought up again. And all we talked about and felt was the love we had for those men.
Next morning, I got up, and I'm thinking that I was around Monty Joe when I heard, because Monty Joe had found out, and he's the one that had to tell the players. And we were getting ready to go into breakfast, and one of my classmates, who was also a freshman, Monty Joe mentioned this, Carol Mundy, her dad, Pee Wee, was on the plane. And they had to they were just telling Carol. And that's one of the things I can still, it's just like it happened yesterday. You can imagine. The ride home was surreal. It was a dark, cloudy day, and it was just a pall, just a sad. You could hear a pin drop on the bus. Joe Hunter, his son Joey, was a student at Madison. And the only one of the 10 that I did not know at all was J.D. Frankenberger, who I think he had come to Eastern to go to school, and then he took over the, East Main Liquor. He was running that, and he was 24 years old. I mean, can you imagine? He was 10 years older than me, and I was 14, and he lost his life. And Jimmy House was younger. Jimmy House, I think, was 21. It's just, you think back on it, and it's crazy.
I just heard about the next morning on the news, just is on the radio station that I heard it, and it's hard to believe, really.
My mother told me about it. I just loved him to death. I love my mother too, but I was a daddy's girl, and they were divorced, so I went and lived with my father. I had a 10-month-old baby, so we lived with Daddy. A lot of people told me that down there, he talked about the plane and how it felt, and some of the people down there asked him if he wanted to ride back with them. And he said, no, I came down here with them, with my friends. I'm gonna go back with them. My sister was a cheerleader, so she actually was down there, and my brother, he went with a bunch of guys. So he was down there too, so I actually didn't see them until they got back home the next day, and it was just something we just never thought would happen.
At 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm cooking pancakes for the Lions Club in Webster County. And I get a call from a good friend of mine that tells me about this, and I could not believe it, because just a few hours before that, I had gone to the Holiday Inn in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and was with Monty Joe Lovell, who coached Madison High football team, and we were sitting there talking about the loss, and they were dying at the same time. So that's kind of the story that I associate with the accident. That particular night, Huey Robbins and J.T. Frankenberger and Mundy, all three asked me if I would give them a ride out to this party that they were having for Ben Robinson. Ben Robinson's dad was a distributor here in Richmond, and the same guy was a distributor in Hopkinsville. They threw a big party for all these guys. So I drove them out there, and they never did get out of my car. They sit right in my car, and that's when Mundy started singing "Good Time Charlie's Got the Blues," and that rings in my ears to this day.
My grandfather just never recovered from Hugh's death. And I remember my dad telling me one time, he died of a broken heart. Just could not recover from that. If families have favorites, it was Hugh. We had been in Cincinnati, and we were coming back, probably mid-afternoon, but the news came on the radio radio's this thing that used to be around years ago. So. But the news came on the radio that there had been a plane crash in western Kentucky with men going to a football game. And that was about all. And I remember Dad getting really quiet, and he looked over at my mom. He said, "Betsy, you don't think Huey would have been on that plane, do you?" And I don't recall much more conversation happening the whole way home. There was a note on the door. We saw the note, said, okay, this is bad news. And about that time, my uncle, Ida's husband, came pulling up, and they were living in Fort Wayne, Indiana at the time. So he was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and now he's at our house. Yeah, it was really bad. You know, that's the only time I've ever seen my dad cry. I remember it. I mean, that marks you.
Saturday morning, I was still living at home, and my mother came and woke me up, and she kind of prepped me a little bit, because when you wake up, you're not totally with it. And she told me what had happened. I just broke down. I couldn't believe it. We were playing Morehead State that afternoon, and I was in charge of the press box, and I knew I had a big day ahead of me. So the first thing I did, our Vice President for Public Affairs, Don Feltner, lived around the corner, and he knew Roy and knew all the guys, plus the other 6, because he'd been in Madison County forever. And we talked about what we were going to do at the ball game, how we were going to denote what happened, a moment of silence, and we just sat there for a minute, just kind of in disbelief.
I lived at home at the time I was a student, and I think it was about 7 o'clock in the morning. I think my mom said, "You need to listen to the radio," because she had gone to work, and she called me and said, "You need to turn on the radio." And that's how I first heard it. I turned on WEKY radio and heard the news announcement, and I was just totally shocked. I went to the game with, at that time, my girlfriend, and we sat out in the stands for that game. It was a real dreary, rainy, misty Saturday morning, I remember, and the game was, that afternoon, it was still the same. It was just very gray, overcast, and I guess you'd have to say it was appropriate for the mood of the day, because it was just, one of the worst days that I can remember, when I was in my early 20s.
And I told him what I wanted to do. And then the plane crash happened in November of '72. And, of course, that ended. It's hard even today. It ended a great friendship.
And it was terrible what they had to go through and their families had to go through. And I think out of 10 funerals, I must have made 7 or 8 of them. It was hard not to have some conflicts, Everybody knew them, as I think I've heard you say. If you didn't know them, you knew somebody that did. And it was very difficult.
And I was a young man then, and just in going from Grigg's Funeral Home to Brogan Robson Powell to Turpin Funeral Home, and seeing all your buddies there, that's, it's just, it was just an eerie, sad time. And, if you sit and think about it, how many communities can say that you lost that many people, young people in a community at one time? That's pretty devastating.
Wish he was here, still here, and sometimes I talk to him. You know, I just miss him. Just really miss him. That's about all I can say.
The thing about the crash, it connected all facets of the community. You had African American, you had businessmen, you had lawyers, you had just general sports fans. So it was just kind of encompassed Madison County and Richmond. The funerals were held earlier the next week, and I remember I went to 3 of those. I was involved in 2 of those, and it was just kind of a downer week for sure.
You know, you might remember that the first Christian church burned when you were 6 or 7 years old, but that people didn't die there, but these young men did. And so it is a collective tragedy, and the community then, during all of these times, and now help us, not just me, but all of the members of the family and the collective community get through it, I think, by remembering this group of people and honoring them. And one of the things that has helped me over the years is, number one, during, when he died and all those young men died, the whole community came out. When we're going from, the limousine from the funeral home into the church, just people all around. The church was packed, people everywhere. There were several funerals on the same day. Even though that time is kind of a fog to me now for 50, it's been a long time, and then you think about what do you remember when a close relative died. Sometimes you don't remember a whole lot, but you remember odds and ends and special things. But I remember that lots of people in the community around.
We saw out of the Richmond community was that folks were there. That's about the best we could do, is to surround them with our love, sincere caring, still the shock and the numbness, but yet. And the community took some measures to make sure that they were never forgotten in memorials and things like that. So, physical memorials.
Up at the park where they have the memorial. That was done by my father. So we were members of the Episcopal Church, which is the RAC Center now. And as you go in the main doors near Central Bank, there was a space between the First Baptist Church and the Episcopal Church. And in that space, my father had built, along with his friends who contributed money, and Rudolph Leake that helped him, and Wilson Bond that helped him. They built a little garden. And it was set up like it is up at the park. You've been up at the park and seen how it's laid out. Well, that was set up there. You went into it was kind of like a figure 8 type thing. You went into one little room, and, it had a little plaque up there about who, what happened and why this little garden is there. And then you kind of went in this other area, and that's where the plaques were laid out, just like the plaques are laid out at the park.
That when the children ask in the days to come, what do these stones mean? Then tell them the story. So we have stones, literally and figuratively, around the city that speak to the presence and the contributions of those men who were on that plane. And when the children ask, who is this? Or what does this mean? Those of us who remain can tell them the story.
To see the picture, just to, you think about going right straight down Main Street, and everything stopped. Everything. There wasn't anybody trying to get around you. There wasn't anybody trying to crawl across the street. Everything stopped. Because I noticed that, going down through there. Wow, this is something. Well, I think number one, for people my age, we realized that we probably weren't bulletproof. Okay, and there were people that I got to know because of other people on the plane just because we were associated, because of the death, and it's like I worked 5191, the plane crash 5191 as a coroner, and that was a big day. Yeah.
Was that hard because of your history?
Mm-hmm.
I just thank the people of Richmond for what all they did for all the families of the guys that were killed in the plane crash. Sometimes when I go past Francis Street to go to our church at First Baptist Church, I look over at where he had his car business, car lot, washing cars, detail. I think about him then, what it used to be back there.
So the funerals, I remember my father's distinctly because it was absolutely pouring down rain. And in fact, I know me and my brother did not even get out of the funeral car. And, they did the whole military thing, and Mom came, into the car with, the flag, right? And of which I still have. But I remember it was absolutely pouring down rain.
We had a good community around us. We did live in Berea, so it was not something that was brought up all the time. It was more brought up when we would be in Richmond. I'd spend most weekends at my grandparents' house. But it was just something we didn't talk about. My dentist was Freddie Ballou, and we would always talk about it. They were really good friends, and of course Freddie was supposed to be on that plane too. But it was enjoyable to go to the dentist because he had all the stories.
As good a friend I ever had in my life. Yeah. And didn't get to know him that much, because 72, we were 32. We were born in 1940. And so I haven't seen him in 50 years, but he's still on my mind,
Whenever I hear a song being played on the radio, it often rekindles a memory about where I was and what was happening in my life at the time. And that is so true of the song by the Stylistics, which was big back in 1972. It was called I'm Stone in Love with You, which is a love song, but it has a lot of meaning to me. When I turned on the radio on the morning of November 18th to learn the news about the plane crash, that song was the first thing I heard. And still to this day, I think about that awful day when I hear that song. For me, the song makes me think about the dreams and plans all of us had for ourselves back then, and the fact that those plane crash victims had their dreams and plans snuffed out.
I'll never forget the times we had in the summer traveling around, and when you're on an athletic team, even if it's not intercollegiate or interscholastic, you're still a part of a group, and those days meant a lot to me.
My feelings about this have changed over the years as I look back and think, these guys were young, in the peak of their lives, but they were doing exactly what they wanted to be doing it, when they wanted to do it, who they wanted to do it with, and that's how they went out. Tragic, but, I look back and I think, that's okay. They were okay.
It's a bad memory, but it's a memory that these people, what they meant to this community is very important. And what they brought to this community was important. And what's even more important, what they could have done had this not happened, And, I still miss them today.
I would say we want to lift a prayer for that whole group. I think if you say anything at all, they were so good and so supportive, and we've got to hope that they are happier now than they were then. And we know that the Lord was watching over them. regardless.
Joe Hunter was born in Madison County. For the rest of his life, he called it home. Hunter served overseas in World War II as part of the Signal Corps. Upon returning back home from the war, Hunter found himself taking part in a number of local clubs and organizations and becoming the co-owner of Hunter Drive-In Liquor Store. He left behind a wife, a son, a mother, 4 sisters, nieces, nephews, great-nieces, and great-nephews. Joe is buried in the Richmond Cemetery. Charles Clay Shackelford started his life in Corpus Christi but made Madison County his home. He graduated from the University of Kentucky School of Law and served as the Madison County Assistant Attorney and as an attorney at Shackelford and Shackelford Law Firm. He was admitted to practice law by the U.S. District Court and the Kentucky Court of Appeals. He was a Marine and a member of St. Mark Catholic Church. He left behind a wife, a son, a mother, a father, 2 brothers, and a grandmother. Charles is buried in the Richmond Cemetery. Maurice Mundy was a member of the Ferristown Church, a self-made businessman. He owned Mundy's Car Wash. He left behind 2 daughters, a son, a grandson, a sister, and 3 brothers. Maurice is buried in the Maple Grove Cemetery. James Dale J.D. Frankenberger was formerly of Louisville but made his home in Richmond at the time of his death. He was the owner of the Imperial Liquor Store and was a member of the Richmond Lodge of Elks. He left behind a mother, 2 brothers, and a sister. J.D. is buried in the Richmond Cemetery. George Little Vernon was born in Clay County but made his home in Richmond. He was an employee of the IBM Company and a member of the Richmond Lodge. He left behind a mother, a father, 2 brothers, a sister, and several nieces and nephews. George is interned in the Richmond Cemetery. Hugh Francis Robbins was born in Madison County. He served as an attorney in his home county. He was a member of the First Baptist Church and the Richmond Elks Lodge. He left behind a wife, 2 daughters, a son, a mother, a father, 2 brothers, and a sister. Hugh is buried in the Richmond Cemetery. Ben Robinson Jr. was a Madison County native. He worked with his father at City Distribution Company and Richmond Ice Company. He was a member of the Navy and a veteran of the Vietnam conflict. He attended the Christ Episcopal Church and was a member of the Richmond Elks Lodge. He left behind a wife, 2 sons, a mother, a father, a sister, a grandmother, a grandfather, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Ben is buried at the Richmond Cemetery. James Austin Jimmy House was a Madison County native and the editor of the Richmond Daily Register. He was a member of the staff of the Eastern Progress during his time at Eastern Kentucky University. He was a member of First Christian Church. Jimmy was survived by a mother, a father, a sister, a grandmother, and a grandfather. He is buried in the Richmond Cemetery. Roy Russell Watson Jr. was a Richmond native and assistant manager of the Richmond Daily Register. He was also a member of the Eastern Progress staff during his time at Eastern Kentucky University. Roy attended First Christian Church, was a member of the Army, and a veteran of the Vietnam conflict. He left behind a wife, a mother, a father, a sister, and a grandmother. He is buried in the Richmond Cemetery. David Keith Gooseland was a native of Mingo County, West Virginia, but he made his home in Richmond. The former director of revenue of the city of Richmond, Gooseland was employed by Central Vending Company at the time of his death. He left behind a father, a brother, a grandmother, and several aunts and uncles. On this 50th anniversary, we've taken a look back at how this devastating tragedy impacted the small community of Richmond, Kentucky, and how to this day, those who were closest to these 10 young men still hold them dear in their hearts. Memorials are placed all around Richmond so that these 10 young men's lives may never be forgotten.